We have a gentleman here that needs help, and he's not breathing yet. He's not breathing, and we're trying to pump him, but he's not.
Okay, how old is he?
He's 50 years old, sir.
50. He's unconscious. He's not breathing.
You think Michael Jackson's death was just another celebrity overdose? Propofol, bad luck, end of story? One bad doctor, one wrong injection. Lights out? Wrong. His own sister, Janet Jackson, broke her silence in a conversation so private it never hit the press. She didn't whisper rumors. She laid it out cold. Michael Jackson carried pure hate for 5 black gay music legends. 5 men he couldn't stand the sight or sound of. And listen close, because this is where it gets dark. Each one of them, they didn't just cross him, they quietly, indirectly, walked him straight to that final propofol drip on June 25, 2009. One planted the first seed of addiction decades earlier. One opened the secret doors to the pills that never stopped. One fed the paranoia that kept him reaching for more. They weren't in the room when the heart monitor flatlined, but their fingerprints? All over the trail that led there. Janet said it herself. These weren't petty beefs. These were slow poison, grudges that festered into something fatal. Hollywood sealed this story under layers of tributes and tears, but secrets like this, they don't stay buried forever. If your stomach just dropped, if you're already wondering who these 5 names are, hit that like button right now. Smash subscribe. Turn on notifications, because in the next few minutes, we're naming them. And once you hear exactly how each one indirectly guided the king of pop to his grave, you'll never hear those classic songs the same way again. Still breathing? Good, let's expose it. 1. Luther Vandross, a deadly medical network. And from the moment the names began to surface, one name always made the room go quiet. Luther Vandross was born on April 20, 1951, in New York City, on a rainy spring morning that neighbors later remembered as unusually gray. He grew up surrounded by records, radio static, and a kind of musical discipline that did not tolerate weakness. From childhood, Luther was meticulous. He practiced until his throat burned. He rewrote melodies until they felt airtight. Even as a teenager singing background vocals, he moved like someone who knew he would not get many chances to be forgiven for mistakes. By the late 1970s, Luther's voice had become impossible to ignore. It was smooth without being fragile, powerful without shouting, intimate without begging. When Never Too Much exploded in 1981, it did more than crown him the king of R&B ballads. It changed the emotional temperature of the genre. Luther sang love like a private confession, not a performance. And according to those close to the industry, that terrified some people. Janet Jackson would later hint carefully that her brother Michael Jackson felt conflicted about Luther from the very beginning. Not hatred in the obvious sense, but something sharper, something quieter. Michael, she suggested, believed Luther stole attention without spectacle, that his voice alone commanded rooms Michael had to choreograph, costume, and control. Janet recalls moments in the early 1980s when Michael referred to Luther dismissively, then fell silent when Luther's songs came on the radio. Once, according to her, Michael muttered that Luther was a velvet viper, a phrase that stuck because it sounded rehearsed, loaded, unfinished. The rumors that followed Luther were constant and cruel. His sexuality became a topic of speculation despite his refusal to label himself publicly. Industry insiders whispered, tabloids hinted. Luther responded by retreating further into discipline. He avoided parties. He controlled his circle. He trusted doctors more than people. And that is where the story darkens. Janet never claimed certainty, but she suggested a pattern. In the late 1990s, Hollywood was awash in discreet medical services for high-profile artists. Physicians who did not ask questions, who traveled at night, who promised sleep, calm, relief. According to Janet, Luther had knowledge of this world, not as an abuser of it, but as someone who had learned how dangerous touring, anxiety, and pressure could become without chemical intervention. She hinted that Luther once introduced Michael to contacts who specialized in off-the-books care. Not contracts, not clinics, just names passed quietly between people who needed control. This is where everything must be treated as allegation, not fact. Janet never named doctors. She never accused Luther of harm. She spoke instead of unintended consequences, of doors opened without knowing what would walk through later. Years before Michael's death, she recalled a conversation in Los Angeles, late evening, cool air settling over the hills when Michael complained about insomnia and pain. Janet says Luther's name came up casually, like a reference point, like someone who had figured things out. Time passed. Careers diverged. Luther's health declined after a stroke in 2003, leaving him vulnerable, partially silenced. Michael's world narrowed, his circle shrinking into dependency and paranoia. When Luther died on July 1, 2005, at 54, the industry mourned quietly. There were no scandals, no public feuds, just absence. But Janet claims the past resurfaced in the final months of Michael's life. In June 2009, Los Angeles was unusually warm, the nights heavy, air unmoving. Michael, according to those around him, drifted in and out of consciousness, medicated, exhausted, frightened. Janet was not there, but she says she later heard from someone who was. In those last hours, Michael reportedly mumbled fragmented phrases, half-sentences, names that made no sense to the people in the room. And among them, she says, was Luther's. Not spoken clearly, not shouted, whispered. "Velvet Viper," Michael allegedly murmured. Not an accusation, not a confession, more like a curse aimed at a memory rather than a man. Janet does not interpret this as blame. She interprets it as fear. Fear that choices made years earlier had circled back, unrecognizable, lethal. The official record would later focus on Conrad Murray, on propofol, on negligence. Janet does not dispute that. What she questions is the origin story. How did Michael become comfortable trusting sleep to strangers? How did secrecy become normalized? How did silence replace safety? Luther Vandross, in her telling, was not a villain. He was a mirror, a man who survived by controlling his environment so tightly that it left no room for transparency. A man Michael admired and resented because Luther's strength came from restraint, not spectacle. And in an industry that punished honesty, both men learned to disappear inside systems designed to protect them until they didn't. This is not a story about guilt. It is a story about proximity, about how power moves quietly, about how networks meant to soothe pain can become pathways to catastrophe. Janet's implication is subtle but devastating. Luther did not kill Michael, but Michael may have followed a map first drawn by watching Luther survive. And that is the shock. Because when Michael whispered that name at the end, Janet believes he was not accusing a man. He was cursing a lesson. One that taught him control mattered more than care, silence more than help. And by the time he understood the cost, the room was already too quiet to hear him ask for anything else. 2. Sylvester planted the seeds of Michael Jackson's death 30 years earlier. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself who opened the door first and who followed without knowing where it would lead? Sylvester was already living loudly when the rest of the world was still whispering. Born in September 1947 in Los Angeles, Sylvester grew up in a strict religious household where difference was treated like danger. By the late 1960s, he had fled that world entirely, reinventing himself in the underground clubs of San Francisco, where disco was not just music, but defiance. He wore makeup. He wore gowns. He sang falsetto with zero apology. And when You Make Me Feel Mighty Real exploded in 1978, Sylvester didn't just become a star. He became a symbol that some people celebrated and others could not tolerate. According to Janet Jackson, this was exactly why her brother, Michael Jackson, reacted so strongly to Sylvester. Not publicly, not in interviews, but privately, viscerally. Janet later hinted that Michael believed Sylvester was too visible, that his open queerness and gender-fluid performance threatened the fragile respectability black artists were fighting to maintain in a hostile industry. Michael, she suggested, felt that Sylvester turned black music into spectacle in a way that invited ridicule rather than power. Their worlds crossed in the late 1970s, when disco clubs in New York and Los Angeles became unavoidable meeting points for artists, producers, and insiders. Janet describes nights thick with smoke and sweat, mirrors fogged over, bass shaking the floor so hard it felt like the building might give way. Sylvester moved through these spaces like royalty. Michael watched from the edges, curious and tense, pulled towards something he did not fully understand and did not fully trust. Here is where Janet's account becomes unsettling. She suggests that Sylvester was not simply a performer, but a gateway. His circle included dancers, fashion figures, party promoters, and people who specialized in keeping artists functional at any cost. Pills were not introduced as drugs. They were introduced as tools, sleep aids, pain relievers, mood stabilizers, things to take the edge off a schedule that never slowed down. Janet says Michael, still young and tightly controlled at home, encountered this world through others long before he had the language to describe it. The parties grew more intense in the early 1980s. Long nights bled into mornings. Music never stopped. According to Janet, Michael attended a handful of these gatherings reluctantly at first, then with increasing frequency. She does not claim Sylvester forced anything. She implies something more insidious. Normalization, the idea that chemical assistance was simply part of surviving fame, that exhaustion was weakness, that sleep could be outsourced. Michael, Janet says, was deeply conflicted. He was fascinated by Sylvester's freedom and repelled by it at the same time. He admired the confidence but feared the consequences. In private moments, Michael reportedly complained that Sylvester was ruining black music by making it about identity instead of discipline. Yet he kept showing up, watching, absorbing, learning. By 1984, disco was declared dead, but the habits remained. Janet hints that some of the connections Michael made during those years never disappeared. They shifted industries, shifted terminology, shifted from clubs to private residences, from stimulants to sedatives, from energy to escape. What began as party culture evolved into medicalized secrecy. Sylvester's own life began unraveling by the mid-1980s. The industry turned cold. AIDS devastated his community. Friends vanished. Bodies piled up. Sylvester retreated, focusing on gospel music and faith. But the damage was done. He died in December 1988, at just 41, from complications related to AIDS. The headlines were respectful, the mourning sincere, but Janet suggests the story did not end there. Years later, as Michael's insomnia worsened and his dependence on medical intervention deepened, Janet says old names resurfaced in conversation, not as accusations, as memories. She recalls Michael speaking about the disco era with bitterness, describing it as the moment things went wrong. In one late conversation, he allegedly referred to Sylvester not by name, but by a phrase that chilled her. "That disco devil," he said, half joking, half afraid. In the final months of Michael's life, when sleep became impossible without intravenous help, Janet claims he began to frame his suffering as destiny rather than illness. She was told that during nightmares, Michael muttered about being led somewhere he never meant to go. In one account she heard later, Michael reportedly called Sylvester a disco demon during a half-conscious episode. Janet does not interpret this literally. She interprets it symbolically, as a mind trying to trace its own origin story. This is not an accusation, it is a pattern. Sylvester did not cause Michael's death. Janet never claims that. What she suggests instead is more disturbing. That exposure came before understanding. That influence arrived before boundaries. That a culture of excess and secrecy planted seeds that took decades to bloom into catastrophe. Sylvester, for his part, lived openly and paid the price early. Michael lived cautiously and paid it later. Two artists shaped by the same industry. Two responses to the same pressure. One embraced visibility, the other ran from it. And somewhere between disco lights and locked bedrooms, a lesson was learned incorrectly. Janet ends this chapter not with blame, but with warning. She believes Michael's anger toward Sylvester was never about sexuality. It was about fear. Fear of becoming what he was taught to avoid. Fear that freedom came with a cost he could not afford. And fear that the first door he walked through, decades earlier, could never truly be closed again. So when Michael spoke of curses and demons at the end, Janet believes he was not talking about a person. He was talking about a moment, a night, a decision, and the long shadow it cast over everything that followed. 3. Frankie Knuckles. He didn't kill Michael. He loaded the gun. And if the first two doors led Michael Jackson into secrecy and excess, this next door led him somewhere far quieter, far darker, and much harder to trace. Frankie Knuckles never chased the spotlight, and that is exactly why his name unsettled Michael Jackson more than most. Frankie was born in January 1955 in New York City, raised on soul records, gospel harmonies, and the idea that rhythm belonged to the people who danced to it, not the people who owned it. By the late 1970s, he had left New York for Chicago, a city that felt colder, rougher, and more honest. The winters were brutal, the clubs were underground, and the music that emerged from those basements would quietly change the world. At venues like the Warehouse, Frankie became known not as a performer, but as an architect. He stretched records longer. He stripped vocals down to pulses. He turned disco fragments into something hypnotic and communal. House music was born not in studios, but in sweat-soaked rooms where black and queer bodies moved together without permission. Frankie was openly gay, unapologetic, and uninterested in respectability politics. He let the music speak, and it spoke loudly. According to Janet Jackson, this was exactly what disturbed her brother. Michael, she suggested, believed Frankie was doing something dangerous, not musically, but symbolically. He felt that house music was taking black rhythm and handing it to crowds who did not understand its history. In private conversations, Janet says Michael accused Frankie of giving the heartbeat away, of turning sacred grooves into anonymous noise for white dance floors. It wasn't jealousy in the traditional sense. It was fear of loss, fear of dilution. Their paths crossed indirectly in the mid to late 1980s as house music began creeping into mainstream pop. Frankie remixed tracks for major artists. Producers talked. DJs traveled. Networks formed that operated outside traditional record labels. Janet recalls Michael growing increasingly suspicious of these underground systems. He believed they moved without accountability, without oversight, without loyalty. This is where the story tightens. Janet claims Michael kept a small notebook in the 1990s, not a diary, but a ledger. Names, symbols, notes written in shorthand. She does not claim to have read it fully. She says she saw it once, briefly, during a tense period when Michael was already struggling with insomnia and pain. According to her, one name stood out, circled in red ink: Frankie Knuckles. Janet insists this was not obsession. It was pattern recognition. Michael believed that the same underground networks that distributed music also distributed access to clubs, to doctors, to substances that never appeared on paper. Frankie's world in Michael's mind was one where rules dissolved, where control slipped away, where people survived by knowing who to call after midnight. In the early 1990s, Michael's physical pain intensified. Touring injuries, stress fractures, anxiety that refused to settle. Janet says this was when Michael began seeking solutions outside traditional medicine. Sleep clinics failed. Prescriptions stopped working. He wanted something stronger, something exclusive, something discreet. And this is where Janet places the most unsettling suggestion. She does not accuse Frankie directly. She describes proximity. She suggests that through Frankie's extended circle, Michael became aware of a new class of substances. Not street drugs, not party stimulants, medical-grade sedatives discussed in whispers. Drugs that promised deep, uninterrupted sleep without emotional vulnerability. Drugs that were said to be used by elite performers who could not afford collapse. The details are intentionally vague. Janet does not name intermediaries. She does not provide documents. She describes a culture, a belief that certain doors, once opened, never fully close. What began as underground nightlife logistics in Chicago evolved into something far more dangerous when transplanted into Hollywood's private bedrooms. Frankie's own life followed a different trajectory. By the late 1990s, his health declined. Diabetes, complications. He withdrew from constant touring. He focused on legacy rather than expansion. When he died in March 2014, tributes poured in. He was remembered as a pioneer, a healer, a man who gave voice to a community. No scandal attached. Michael, however, carried something unresolved. Janet recalls that in the final years of her brother's life, he spoke less about enemies and more about inevitability. He talked about being set up years earlier, not by individuals, but by environments. In one quiet moment, she remembers clearly, Michael allegedly said that some people did not need to kill you. They just needed to introduce you to the right things and step back. In this context, Frankie's name resurfaced not as a villain, but as a symbol, a marker for the moment Michael believed control slipped away. Janet later whispered a sentence that has never been quoted publicly, only paraphrased. "Frankie didn't pull the trigger," she said, "but he loaded the chamber a long time ago." This is not proof, it is perspective. Frankie Knuckles did not cause Michael Jackson's death. Janet does not say that. What she suggests is more unsettling. That influence can be unintentional, that networks built for creativity can also normalize risk. That underground systems, when exposed to vulnerable stars, can metastasize into something lethal. Michael's anger toward Frankie, Janet believes, was rooted in guilt as much as resentment. Guilt for walking into spaces he did not understand. Guilt for trusting systems that promised relief without consequences. Guilt for mistaking freedom for safety. As this chapter closes, the pattern becomes clearer. Luther represented secrecy. Sylvester represented excess. Frankie represented access. 3 doors, 3 lessons misunderstood. And each one, in its own way, moved Michael closer to a point of no return. The shock is not that these men crossed paths. It's that Michael believed the damage was done long before the world noticed anything was wrong. If this name shocked you, subscribe now, because the next chapter goes even deeper into Michael Jackson's private fears and the figures he believed pushed him past the point of no return. 4. Little Richard. The idol Michael Jackson said betrayed the roots. And if you think you're prepared for what comes next, stay with us, because this chapter is the one Janet warned would shock people the most. Little Richard was already a legend when Michael Jackson was still learning how to stand in the spotlight. Born in December 1932 in Macon, Georgia, Little Richard didn't just perform music. He detonated it. Tutti Frutti tore through the 1950s with a sound so wild it terrified white America and unsettled black elders at the same time. Makeup, flamboyance, gospel scream twisted into rock and roll. Richard broke every rule and paid for it with exile, ridicule, and obsession. Michael Jackson admired him deeply at first. Janet later described Michael studying Richard's performances frame by frame, mimicking the energy, the confidence, the refusal to shrink. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Michael was a child star navigating rooms filled with adults, Richard represented survival through excess. Loudness as armor, performance as protection. But admiration, Janet says, slowly curdled into something darker. Their paths crossed intermittently across decades, especially during industry events in Los Angeles and New York, where history and power collided backstage. According to Janet, Michael later spoke about those early encounters with confusion rather than nostalgia. He described environments that felt unsafe, unstructured, and ruled by people who blurred boundaries. Janet is careful with language. She does not accuse. She recounts Michael's feelings: fear, betrayal, loss of control. Here's where the story becomes difficult and where it must be told as allegation, not fact. Janet claims Michael believed that certain elders in the industry exposed him too early to adult worlds he was not prepared to navigate. He felt ushered into rooms where protection was assumed but not guaranteed. He spoke of moments that left him shaken, moments he did not fully understand at the time, but which later returned in flashes of panic and mistrust. Janet does not name specific acts. She describes trauma as Michael described it to her: fragmented, emotional, incomplete. Over time, Michael's view of little Richard shifted dramatically. By the 1980s, as Michael's own fame eclipsed everyone else's, he began referring to Richard with bitterness. Janet recalls Michael accusing Richard of selling the roots, of turning black sacred expression into spectacle that invited exploitation. He felt Richard had opened doors without guarding what walked through. In private moments, Michael reportedly called him a traitor to the roots, someone who survived by sacrificing others to the industry's appetite. This resentment wasn't public. On stage and in interviews, Michael remained respectful. But at home, Janet says, his tone changed. He spoke about generational harm, about elders who did not protect the young because they themselves had never been protected, about how early exposure to chaos rewires the nervous system permanently. As Michael's dependence on isolation, medication, and control grew, so did his tendency to reinterpret the past. Trauma doesn't remain static. It searches for meaning. Janet recalls that in the 2000s, Michael increasingly framed his struggles as the result of wounds inflicted long before adulthood. He blamed systems, yes, but he also blamed symbols, people who represented the moment innocence cracked. Little Richard became one of those symbols. Richard's own life was full of contradictions, periods of religious devotion followed by returns to performance, public statements about identity that shifted over time. He struggled visibly with faith, shame, and self-acceptance. By the time he aged into elder status, he was both revered and isolated. He died in May 2020, long after Michael, his legacy secure but unresolved. Janet says Michael's fixation on Richard intensified near the end of his life, not because of hatred, but because of unresolved questions. Why was I there? Who was supposed to protect me? Why didn't anyone stop it? In one late conversation, she recalls, Michael allegedly grouped Richard with other old queens, not as an insult about identity, but as shorthand for elders who survived by adapting to an unforgiving industry without creating safety for the next generation. Janet emphasizes this point repeatedly. Michael's anger was not about sexuality. It was about power, about who controlled rooms, about who decided what was normal, about who left children alone with systems designed to consume them. In the final months of Michael's life, when exhaustion blurred reality and memory, Janet says his language turned symbolic. Names surfaced like fragments from dreams. Richard's name appeared among them, not shouted, not cursed aloud, but murmured with resentment and grief, tangled together. Janet does not claim this as proof of anything supernatural. She frames it as a mind circling old pain, looking for anchors. When Michael died, the world focused on doctors, drugs, and negligence. Janet does not dispute those facts, but she insists the roots of the collapse stretch further back, into moments when trust was misplaced, when admiration blinded caution, when elders failed to recognize how much responsibility they carried. This chapter does not accuse little Richard of crimes. It does not rewrite history as certainty. It reveals how Michael understood his own story, fairly or not. Trauma does not require accuracy to be destructive. It only requires belief. And that is the real shock. Not that Michael blamed a legend, but that he believed the damage was done decades earlier in rooms where music was louder than conscience and survival mattered more than protection. If the earlier chapters were about secrecy, excess, and access, this one is about origin, about the moment a child learns the world is not safe, and about how that lesson can echo for a lifetime, shaping fear, addiction, and the desperate need to control everything that comes after. 5. Billy Strayhorn, the jazz ghost, Michael feared would expose him. And just when it seems the trail cannot go any further back, this final name pulls the story into a shadow so old, so quiet, it feels almost untouchable. Billy Strayhorn was never meant to be famous. Born on November 29, 1915, in Dayton, Ohio, he lived in a world where brilliance survived only if it stayed hidden. A prodigy pianist and composer, Strayhorn found his place beside Duke Ellington, crafting masterpieces that carried Ellington's name while his own remained footnoted. Songs like Lush Life and Take the A-Train changed jazz forever. Yet Strayhorn himself learned early that visibility came with punishment. He was gay in an era that allowed no mercy for that truth. So he vanished into the work, into the margins, into anonymity. According to Janet Jackson, this was exactly why her brother, Michael Jackson, became obsessed with Strayhorn's story later in life. Not admiration, fear. Michael saw Strayhorn as a warning, a genius who survived only by erasing himself, a man whose music lived loudly while his identity stayed buried. Janet says Michael spoke about Strayhorn often in the late 1990s and early 2000s, usually late at night, when insomnia tightened its grip. He referred to him not as a composer, but as a ghost. The puppet behind the curtain, Michael allegedly called him. Someone whose fate proved what happened when the industry decided who was allowed to exist fully and who was not. This fear, Janet insists, was not abstract. Michael believed the music industry had long memories and hidden networks. He believed that reputations were controlled quietly, through whispers rather than headlines. He saw Strayhorn as proof that collaborators, not just executives, could shape and destroy legacies from behind the scenes. And most of all, he feared being reduced to the same role. Brilliant, useful, replaceable, silenced. Here is where Janet's claim turns unsettling. She asserts that some remnants of old jazz-era networks never disappeared. They evolved. Musicians aged, doctors aged, pharmacology advanced, but secrecy remained. According to Janet, Michael became convinced that certain rare sedatives and narcotics originally prescribed in earlier decades to manage anxiety and exhaustion in performers were still circulating privately. Not mainstream drugs, not party substances. Vintage medicine, as he allegedly called it. Old formulas, untraceable blends, passed hand to hand through trusted intermediaries. Janet does not name sources. She does not claim Strayhorn himself had any involvement. She frames it as legacy, not intent. Michael believed the culture of concealment born in Strayhorn's era had survived intact. A system where pain was treated quietly and identity was managed chemically, where sleep meant safety, where fear was medicated rather than confronted. By the mid-2000s, Michael's anxiety about exposure had reached a breaking point. Janet recalls him obsessing over headlines, biographies, archival footage. He feared reinterpretation more than scandal. He feared being outed by history itself. In this mindset, medication was not just relief. It was armor, silence, control. Janet believes this fear shaped Michael's final years more than addiction alone. He did not see doctors as healers. He saw them as gatekeepers. And the substances he accepted were not random. They were chosen because they promised something Strayhorn never had: oblivion without confession. In June 2009, as Michael prepared for what would become his final performances, Janet says his language grew darker. He spoke about ghosts watching him, about men who disappeared correctly and lived on through others. In one moment, she describes tearfully, Michael allegedly said he would rather die misunderstood than live exposed. Janet insists this sentence haunted her long after his death. When Michael collapsed on June 25, 2009, the world focused on the immediate cause: medication, negligence, one doctor. Janet does not deny those facts, but she argues they explain the mechanism, not the motive. The motive, she believes, was terror. Terror of being revealed. Terror of losing control of his narrative. Terror learned by studying men like Strayhorn, who survived by never being fully seen. Janet wept when she spoke of this final connection, not because she blamed Strayhorn, but because she saw how deeply Michael internalized that lesson. Billy was the last ghost, she said quietly. Michael didn't die because of one doctor. He died because fear ate him alive from the inside. Strayhorn himself died in 1967, young, his name still secondary to the music he shaped. Michael believed that fate was worse than death, to exist only as function, to be remembered without being known. And that belief, Janet insists, shaped every decision that followed. As the music fades and the image of Michael falls into slow motion, this final chapter reframes the entire story, not as a conspiracy of villains, but as a lineage of silence, a tradition of hiding, a legacy where survival required disappearance. In Janet's telling, Michael Jackson did not just fear exposure. He inherited that fear. And by the time he realized the cost, the ghost he had been running from was already inside him. That was the list, straight from Janet's own words: 5 names, 5 grudges, 5 invisible threads that all seemed to pull toward the same final night. But the most uncomfortable question still hangs in the air. Did the king of pop fall because of his own choices, or because those choices were shaped long before he ever realized the trap was closing? Maybe there was no single villain. Maybe the real danger was a lifetime of fear, silence, and lessons learned from the wrong people at the wrong time. An industry that rewards brilliance, protects power, and leaves trauma to rot in the dark. By the time the world noticed Michael was drowning, the damage may have already been done decades earlier. Now it's your turn to decide. Out of these 5 names, who do you believe posed the greatest danger to Michael Jackson? The one who opened the door, the one who normalized the risk, or the one who planted fear so deep it never let go? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you're ready to keep digging into the stories they never wanted told. Rest in peace, Michael Jackson. Or perhaps rest uneasily in a truth the world is still afraid to face.